Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Welcome to Cahnmann's Current Events Roundtable. We are again lucky, very lucky, to have one of my favorite guests back on the show, David Hacker, Dr. David Hacker. This time you're going to be talking on climate change, good and bad. And the reason we had David to come on the show today is because there's been so much dispute on climate change. Is it good? Is it bad? Are we ready for doomsday? What is it exactly? I'm going to give you a little opening from John Steele Gordon, who is an author, and he wrote that the climate is an enormously complex system with a very large number of inputs and outputs, many of which we don't fully understand, and some we may well not even know about yet. There is much contradictory evidence for assertions of a coming global warming catastrophe. It isn't to deny anything, it is to state the fact. The essence of scientific inquiry is the assumption that there is always more to learn. And that is so true, isn't it, David?
Absolutely.
So today I really want you to talk about, we're going to do a little talking about all these assertions that people have given. And I know one of the people that you also have a little bit of the, when Al Gore wrote that Inconvenient Truth, and he latched onto his film and said this is it. And you said you consider it an alarmist film. And possibly why did you see it as alarmist film? As a scientist, I guess there's a lot to prove, and maybe that's what you need to address of why you saw it as an alarmist film. And is climate change good or is it bad?
It depends on where you're sitting.
Depends on where we...
I mean, the history of climate change is nothing new. It's gone back to the 19th century when Arrhenius, a chemist in Sweden, discovered that carbon dioxide essentially inhibited heat transfer from the Earth back into space. With that, and that was controversial, by the way, that was not something that was quite accepted.
That was wasn't that, David, that was in 1890?
1890.
Yeah, I mean, we need to state that because that's, I mean, you're quoting from a scientist from Sweden from 1890.
And the fact is that what have we learned as time has gone on in the past century? Well, what we've learned is that there are two facts. One, he was correct, that carbon dioxide is an absorption gas. That's why it's called a greenhouse gas. Moreover, we have begun to correlate the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over a period of about 100 years now. And what we have seen is that there has been an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
And where does all that carbon
dioxide
coming from? Not monoxide, but dioxide.
Well, let's say carbon dioxide is very different than carbon monoxide.
Exactly.
Okay. First of all, what we've learned is that there's a correlation between what we have noticed, and we've begun to measure temperatures on the surface of the planet. And we have found a correlation between carbon dioxide concentration, the increase in carbon dioxide concentration, and the increase in surface temperature. These are the two facts that stand out. And as deniers or as acceptors, whatever you want to think, these are the facts. Now, what do you do with these facts?
Right.
Well, what we did do is began to evaluate when did this increase start. And much of the data seemed to go back to about 1800, which is almost the inception of the Industrial Revolution. Hence, the controversial issue is it man-made or is it a natural occurrence?
Right, because that's what some people say. It's a natural occurrence that we, in fact, one of my papers here had said it's a very natural occurrence because it's happened in 1978. Global warming, a harsh reality, and one says that Exit Glacier has been shrinking for 200 years since 1815, and also one of my papers say there are 300-year-long medieval heat wave followed by a little ice age that began in 1300, and then the 300-year warming period we're in now. So I mean, we got people that are talking about the oh my goodness, how many years ago was that, the medieval heat wave in the 1300s? So, and everybody seems to be writing a book and they're saying that they know what exactly is happening.
Well, let me give you some of my feelings about it. I would not call myself an expert in climatology. However, in reading the data, one observation I have is what are the facts? The facts of this are carbon dioxide concentration increase and surface temperature increase. These are correlated. The question is, has the carbon dioxide concentration increased faster than a natural occurrence would have expected? And what we find is that indeed it has. Now we still don't exactly know what has been the contribution of man-made carbon dioxide concentration.
I mean, they talk about cars, airplanes, ships. You mentioned industrial plants to me, and people, population, and
well, we know where the sources of carbon dioxide.
Volcano. We can tell our viewers.
There are all kinds of. There are many sources. Which is the major contributor to carbon dioxide? We have believed, I think, in the time that the studies have been made now, that much of the industrial use of fossil fuel has been one of the major culprits. Hence, we have seen all kinds of arguments that we ought to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as a result.
Do you agree on that?
To some extent, since I don't know what the answers are of the future, I can't foresee the future, and I don't think anybody else can. I think we can make prognostications about the future, and that's about it. We can say we think as a result of what has occurred, this will occur. That is essentially, to me, looking into a crystal ball. We have no absolute certainty of the results. What we have done? So what we have done, we have developed what we call models, circulation models of the planet and its atmosphere, and we have used as inputs the various input functions which are essentially sources of carbon dioxide. And we have found out what are the consequences of doing this. Now this is a model, a mathematical model. This is different than anything we have done in the past. We have never used a preconceived mathematical model to predict the future.
So all these studies that made prior to what we're talking about, you had mentioned to me a little bit earlier before the show, they don't seem to have any, they didn't write down some of these facts that's happened a long time ago, or didn't they have the proper measurements?
We didn't
what is it
have,
exactly
well,
that
let's
was
look
missing?
at it. What do we think? What are we doing? We have become more sophisticated with respect to measurements. We do a better job today than we ever did. Let's face it, we know progress has made a tremendous impact on our ability to measure things. Now, in 1800, the measurements were very primitive. We can only estimate what they were, and they may have well been estimates of the time. But what we do know is with current technology and current ability to sense what we see, we have done a better job, okay? So that now we can say with some certainty, we know what the concentration of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And what we have noticed is there's been a dramatic increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide within the past 50 years. Okay, that's a significant fact. So, what do we attribute it to? Well, there's the problem. What do we attribute it? We know how much.
I think that's what we need to
This is what we have
understand.
to know. How much has contributed from each source that we have, and we have several sources. And what has been found with some of the studies is that the major contribution has been a result of industrialization.
And the industrialization came,
And industrialization started in about 1800.
okay.
When
And that
you
was
really
coal,
think
right?
about
They
it.
were using a lot of
We
coal
have
there.
no other source of fuel. I mean, remember the history of fuel use goes back to man using wood
Right.
primarily.
Right.
And we used wood for a long time. Coal was not discovered. It was discovered in China by Marco Polo. It wasn't used essentially in the West for very, very long until probably the mid-18th century, when we began to realize that coal is a much more concentrated source of energy than wood. Okay?
Well, what throws out the most carbon dioxide of all the
Well,
energy?
coal gives rise to an enormous amount of carbon dioxide. It also gives rise to many other things like ash and other things that you have to get rid of.
And there are countries that still use coal. I think China and India and a lot of these countries
Because
still
they
use
have no
coal.
other sources of fuel. So we, as a civilization, have been dependent on coal. More recently, and when I say more recently, that goes back a long way because let's face it, the first oil well was discovered in somewhere around 1870 or 1860. I may be a little mistaken on that, but basically that was the beginning of the concern about oil. But oil was not used as a fuel, indeed. It was attempted by many to use it to light your houses,
Right.
not to heat them or
Right.
to run vehicles. We didn't have vehicles, remember, at that
Yeah,
time.
they had
So
lamp
here
lights that were
we had
oil
lamp lights,
lamp lights,
oil lamps.
right.
We were using
Oil lamps.
whale oil. We
Right.
were killing whales.
Right.
We were doing all kinds of things to get light. So we are dependent on light and heat to keep us alive. Okay, we come around to the turn of the century and fuel. What is the point? Someone discovers a machine, an automobile, that will use the fuel that's being pumped out of the ground. Petroleum becomes important. So it's really, we're going back only 100 years for the use of oil. And oil begins to be an important source of energy. That's what it's about. How does society advance? It advances through energy.
Right. So what is, when we talk about this and people talk about also the carbon dioxide and the glaciers that are starting to
Let's
disappear.
start. What have we seen?
What are
have
we
seen
saying
in the
then?
past 40 years? We have seen a decline in the Arctic glacial, in the snow cover in the Arctic and in the Antarctic.
Now, do you think it comes from carbon dioxide?
Well, it comes
or
from
is it
one
from
thing.
something natural that's coming from the atmosphere itself or something?
What does it come from? It comes from a global warming. The reason the ice sheets are melting is that the temperatures of the planet are increasing.
But you did mention earlier to me that volcanoes,
That's
they
a
have
small source.
Yeah, they
That's
have
a small,
they
these
have
are
sulfur
small-
dioxide
these
that
are
comes
small-
out
these are-
of
we
it.
got rid of. Remember, we had a major thing on acid rain. That was part of the sulfur dioxide, and we did do some major changes. We encouraged major changes in sulfur dioxide.
But I'm
we
wondering,
curtailed
is it that the planet is doing it itself? It's done it for thousands and thousands of years?
Yes, it
And we're
has.
just being more aware of it now?
I think that's one factor.
Okay.
I think it is. But I do think that the fact that we have noticed that a man-made source of utilization of various fossil fuels has been important in the additional increase in carbon dioxide. So, what do we do about it? What is the consequence of it?
Yeah.
Do we know?
Is it all bad?
Well, that's the point. Is it all bad? At one time, people thought that by warming the planet, we would improve the temperature of, of man's living, that the conditions would be improved, that there'd be more forestation, because after all, the temperature increases, you get an increase in forestation. And what else do we see? We have seen the fact that you will necessarily use less energy to heat your house. That's an improvement. That's a positive side. What's the negative side? Well, what happens when you increase temperature? You increase infestation of insects.
And insects carry
And insects,
disease.
we may, as one pointed out, you may have an increase in malaria. You may have an increase in Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You may have those things affecting man. You will also find increasing levels of the ocean, because of the melting ice caps would increase the depth of the oceans and therefore encroach on shorelines. You will then...
You're thinking about
Yeah,
water
and
shortage. Would that be water shortage?
Not water shortage, but an increase in the ocean levels.
Which means
that the areas that are on the coastline would be endangered. And those populations that are living on land that are at the sea, like at, for example, Katrina, the sea level is almost at the level of the surface. It is not a lot of difference, so that you can, as the water rises, it floods. The areas will flood. That's a problem. That's something that is not a positive.
So it comes from
So
a lot
that
of
you're
flooding.
endangering people that live on coastal areas, that are low-lying coastal areas. Where are these areas? India, for example, on the coasts of India, Bangladesh are very low-lying levels, and therefore may be flooded.
So what you're saying in some of this is that people are making blanket statements. People are saying it's good or it's bad, and they don't have the right scientific knowledge on some of these things.
This is not, in a sense, not a factual science in my mind. It's what you have to observe, and as you see it, then you come up with facts. If you don't see it, you don't know about it. I mean, we can address the problem of coral change, for example, and why that happened. Well, one argument is that the seas have become more acidic as a result of the increase in concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so that the oceans will absorb more carbon dioxide, which converts the carbon dioxide into carbonic acid. And that would increase the acidity of the ocean. Now, what is a consequence of that? We are not certain. But would it change the nature of the flora and fauna of the sea? Would it change the fish concentration, the kind of fish? And there are many factors that we have no answer to.
Well, David, what is some of the general disagreement among scientists regarding climate change?
One of the arguments is that indeed, there have been some over-exaggerated positions that have been taken by the International Panel on Climate Control, which is a UN agency that has delivered various kinds of reports. The latest report, the one that I think Obama will attend very soon in Europe, has made some recommendations on what ought to be done. These are committees that are sitting and making decisions about policy. This is different than the ordinary scientific endeavor. I mean, normally in science you do things, you make an experiment, you observe the consequences, and you have a fact. This is done by committee. It's different. We have two things that are going on. One, we have committee hearings, and how they make that is not very clear to me at times, but they are making decisions about how we ought to behave, how we ought to reduce.
And those are scientists on these committees.
And there are many of all kinds
not
of
just
people.
politicians.
Not politicians.
Because I don't want to hear
everybody.
from politicians.
No, politicians. These are scientific communities that are doing this. But the fact is that it's done by a general agreement. It is not done by an individual scientist discovering something. That's a difference. It's uncertain what the consequences of that is. Nobody seems to know the answer to this. I mean, what I find now is that we are more confused than ever before in what the consequences of all of this will be. We see certain things occurring. We know that the Arctic has opened up for waterways. Just recently you saw that. Obama just went up to Alaska to view that we are able to ship across the top of the globe now.
Is that good?
That's good. To
Okay.
extent, that is
So-
good. It's
so
shortening the routes.
that is good.
That's a good point. But what is a bad point? Well, some of the flora and fauna are disappearing. The lands of the north are tundra. They're essentially built on ice. And as the ice melts, the tundra collapses. And so they're very worried in Alaska about much of the land that may be essentially dissolving. That's a bad fact. Okay, so we don't know. We have to see what happens. We can anticipate it. So what do we do in the meantime? We do the best we can.
And you mentioned to me, right before the program began, you mentioned to me about nuclear. Now, a lot of people are extremely concerned about nuclear. Nobody wants it in their backyard. And yet you said to me that nuclear is probably the best way to go. That will eliminate a lot of the fossil fuels.
What are the advantages?
Yeah,
there
what
are
are the-
disadvantages.
yeah.
We all have
Yeah.
uncertainties about nuclear power. Hence, we have this opposition that exists in the public's mind today. So the results of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and all these other things that have accumulated in our mind, and Fukushima in Japan after the typhoon that hit the Japanese coastline and inundated the nuclear reactors. Yes, there are concerns. There are serious concerns of safeguarding. But nuclear power in itself is far more advantageous than fossil fuel. Of course, there is no carbon dioxide emitted by a nuclear reactor. Okay? So you've eliminated it totally. In the meanwhile, what have we done? We've discovered natural gas, which has half of the concentration of carbon dioxide that coal does. So indeed,
A lot of our countries are finding, even
we're
in
beginning
Israel,
to
they're
do that.
finding
So we're moving-
natural gas. Yeah.
You're quite right. We're moving now to use natural gas as a source of power. That's a good thing. And natural gas, I think in my last interview with you, I suggested that natural gas is about half the carbon dioxide output that coal does. So it would
That's
be,
when we were talking about
yeah.
fracking.
So, but
because
what
when
is
you
the
came- yeah.
downside? What is the downside of this change in fossil fuel to natural gas, for example, or to nuclear power? You're displacing a whole industry. The coal industry is an important industry in many countries.
So you say that we're back into politics right now
You
because
always are.
politics,
Politics are
because
always there.
politics really has something to do. So there is something like nuclear. We're always saying nuclear. We think of a nuclear bomb, but nuclear is also used positively for things like in place of fossil fuel, but then there's the fossil fuel, and then the fossil fuel, all the gas companies saying, "Oh, I'm not going to be able to produce this anymore. We're going to lose all our
We are in a process of change.
Unless we could change their thoughts and they can
They
start
will
doing
change.
nuclear, so they wouldn't be displaced.
May I just answer some of that?
Absolutely.
One of the things is that economics drives most things we do. Okay? If it is cheaper to use natural gas, and it is indeed today cheaper to use natural gas than it is coal, coal will be displaced. And we are seeing the results of that. Coal-fired power plants are being closed down. And most people are not aware of it, but it's indeed occurring. Or they're making transformations in the industry to utilize natural gas. That's the first thing. So that's a good sign. However, that does not solve the problem of carbon dioxide emission. We're still using a fossil fuel, and we recognize that. But in the meanwhile, we have cut our carbon dioxide concentration emissions in half. That is important. That's
But also,
one.
David, we didn't talk about the population. Population, when we're talking, we're excreting
We don't know the
carbon
answer to that.
dioxide, right?
We don't know
And
the
they-
answer to that.
and
We just know that increasing populations must have some impact on carbon dioxide concentration, because that's what we breathe out. And the more people you have, the more carbon dioxide is being breathed out.
Yeah, because people think of carbon dioxide, it's just coming out of fossil fuels. It's coming out of our mouths.
That's correct. So we have a problem. This is a problem. Controlled population isn't a question that we have to ask ourselves. What do we do? If we are serious about this problem of climate change and the impact it may have, and we don't know, we have to know all the sources that are contributing to it. And clearly, at the present time, the most significant source that we know of is, we have put population at the bottom of this list. The contributing source that we now are devoted our attention to is the issue of transportation and power generation. And those will be handled, and I think that there is a reasonable solution, as I just mentioned, that the transfer to natural gas would be a solution to the problem, partial. But in the end, we mentioned nuclear power before. This is the one most significant thing that we are so adverse to that we refuse to argue the problem of whether we should increase the number of nuclear power plants.
And I made a suggestion. I was thinking they could be buried under the ground. But then you said something to the fact, we think about when we were doing fracking, people were worried about the fracking getting into the water
That's
supply.
Right. So you have consequences, and you have to foresee all of the consequences and the reactions to these things. Nuclear power right now has a bad name. People, don't know how to get rid of the waste. They think we have made very little progress, but we do have solutions, and we have to recognize. And we do have an improvement in the nature of the power plant we're thinking about that will utilize nuclear power.
So it won't be the type of power plant that they had in Chernobyl.
No, of course not. That is a foregone. No, we're not going back
to people
something.
That's stuck in their minds,
well,
isn't
they
it?
unfortunately think of nuclear power and they think of Chernobyl. That's unfortunate because we have made progress on designs of nuclear reactors that are much more safe than had in the past. That we know we can do. You have to begin to argue that the public view of nuclear power is outmoded. And we have to find solutions to get the people to understand that improvements have been made and they are far superior to what we had in the past. And when we can do that, we can begin to open the way for allowing new plants to be built. I mean, there's a hesitancy.
So we only have a couple of minutes more, and the title of the show was Climate Change, Good or Bad. So I'm hearing both sides of the story
because
right now.
I am not one who is arguing the world is ending.